Thank you once again. I guess you're hearing from me a little quickly after the last time, but the presentation that I wanted to prepare for you is, as you can see, related to the National Space Weather Strategy Plan and how it relates to the experience we had in Maine. It's the whole community effect of that call to action includes the states, localities, regions, and whatnot. So I'm just going to review with you just briefly what I said before about the legislation we passed in Maine. Hello? Why isn't that moving? Oh. Oh. Oh dear, I'm all backwards. Oh. That was backwards. I'm gonna. Okay, well, this came up. Okay, this is great. Again, this is what it called for. The Maine Public Utilities Commission was to examine GMD and EMP and report back on the most vulnerable components of the Maine system, potential mitigations, estimates of cost, low, medium, and high cost, time frame for adoption of the mitigation measures, and policy implications. That was in 2013. In 2014, Maine LD 1363, to implement mitigations that were recognized in both studies, failed by 1 vote, which I had mentioned to you before. Oh, I have to go backwards. Okay, so the regulatory resistance was the problem. The PUC dragged its feet, signed only 1 person, I think at halftime, to the study. It had been offered help from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. It did not accept it. It refused to investigate EMP, which actually made it out of compliance with the law we passed, and ultimately had completion of the study shifted to industry control so that Central Maine Power, the predominant electric utility, was made project director of a study task force. So the result was 2 studies, as I said to you before. These, and you've heard the National Space Weather Strategy goals from Bill Murtaugh and others. And this is just to tell you how well it dovetails with the needs that we discovered in doing our legislation in Maine. Benchmarks were a huge issue for space weather events because they were to be pivotal to understanding a modeling base and what we really needed. And the benchmarks for the NERC, North American Electric Reliability Corporation, were far lower than even what had already been experienced in this country. To enhance response and recovery capabilities was a key goal of our legislation. Obviously, to improve protection was the main goal of our legislation, and to improve assessment, modeling, and prediction of impacts on critical infrastructure. I'm really just reading this to you now. The heart of the differences between the 2 studies that emerged were the modeling and the assessments derived from it. The modeling's credibility rested on the benchmarks guiding the modeling. So, you know, going back to the goals of the strategic plan, space weather plan, these are big items, the benchmarks and the modeling. And in fact, what happened with the study that was directed by Central Maine Power is they refused to even use their own data, as I had mentioned to you before, even though they were asked repeatedly, particularly by Bill Harris and Tom Popick of the Resilient Societies. They just sort of didn't answer. And instead, the benchmark they used was from Scandinavia, instead of using their own studies. In this country, there were multiple places where they could have derived data also pertaining to this country. They didn't use that. That's for the geomagnetically induced currents, the GICs. they turned elsewhere and they used a theoretical benchmark rather than something that could have relied on their own data or other American data. Obviously, improving the services through advancing understanding and forecasting and increasing international cooperation, it was important. The thing about the National Space Weather Strategy Plan that causes me a little angst, and of course I know it's evolving and it's a wonderful thing that we have it, it's a huge step forward, is that it doesn't seem to involve input from the states. And multiple states have been working on this, and they're closer to the population, and so I think that would be valuable to encourage them to do that. And also in saying to work with industry on coming up with what is called realistic planning in the strategies is somewhat worrisome also, because the industry played many, many tricks on us to try to say what was reasonable and what wasn't reasonable. So that's something we also have to hope we have enough input that they can discern where the true path will be, and I would encourage support for their calling on outside independent experts also to be involved. One of the things that, in talking about my concern about the too much accepting industry input as the most valid input, is just an example that we heard yesterday when the NERC director of the GMD task force spoke at yesterday's event about recovering from an event, that for a 2-month event, was it 2 or 3 months? Anyway, it was 2 months, I think, that they could, if transformers were destroyed, you could order, receive them, and have them up within 2 months. And I don't think that the man who spoke that way could really believe that, but he's in a position where he sort of has to say what his office wants him to say, I'm sure, because nationwide, the amount of time is a minimum of 18 months to just get them to this country. You know, I don't know about how long it takes to put them up. 18 months to 2 years in normal times. If we had a wide-ranging event, how many people would be in line to get them? They would be shipped from South Korea or Germany, and those places might also have a problem. This is just to illustrate the difference in standards. This shows the force of the 1921 storm at the top, the red marks that you see. That is experienced in 1921. It isn't even considered a huge event. It was a kind of a big one, but it wasn't anything as big as we're worried about. The lower line in blue is the NERC benchmark. So that's what they think is as high as we should meet. And I think that might be kind of a waste of time. So the value of the Space Weather Action Plan, the Maine PUC and Central Maine Power were not the only parties in the industry, regulatory, and legislative environment who compromised the rigor of the study. There was plenty of pushback in different places, and lobbyists were working hard one way and another. There were sins of commission and omission by various entities, and including federal agencies and departments who should already have been helping us. The Space Weather Action Plan calls all levels of government, business, and the public agencies to account. It assigns duties, this is just great, it assigns duties to specific agencies, and it sets time limits, which is really great. And it calls for the electric power industry to engage as a positive force for real, credible, benchmark-based strategies for mitigation and protection. We have to be concerned about keeping everybody honest and making sure that we get the best that we can out of this whole process. It really supports, at the federal level, the path that the Maine legislation, LD 131, frankly blazed at the state level. The things that we learned are the things that they're addressing, and that's part of the reason why I suggest that it'd be well to reach down to the states for input. It needs more teeth, in my opinion, but it takes a big bite out of this very bizarrely political and sensitive apple. That's basically what I was just saying. And thank you all for your attention. Hopefully we can move forward and make a big difference in this country and make sure that we still have a country when we're finished. Thank you very much.
So I would like to address whether we have a strong need for whole-of-community involvement or not. So we start with the Space Weather Action Program that was presented. It appears to recognize that the magnitude of a solar storm could be so vast that it's beyond the capability of the federal government, which doesn't control most of the infrastructure resources anyway, to protect us and to mitigate. So we start with the presumption that whole of government is necessary. But I'd like to then compare what we had. You had earlier today an Assistant Secretary of Homeland Security tell you that the electric grid was incredibly resilient. So let's at least let's take a benchmark from where we were in April 2008. We had the EMP Commission get declassified a major report because in 2004 they issued a report and there was not much action. So they were able to get, and they had to fight to do it, but they were able to get a major report that took several major critical infrastructures, the energy sector, telecommunications, et cetera, and it identified the electric sector as having about 2,200 large power transformers that had extremely long replacement lead times, and they urged that as high a priority as any that required protection. At the time, there were no commercial neutral ground blockers available to purchase, but they had been tested. The concept had been developed by the 1980s. So now let's go 7 years and 8 months later to today. We have one of those 2,200 high voltage transformers with a neutral ground blocker on it. It works fine, but we have one out of 2,200. Let's look at cyber. We had in the Energy Policy Act a requirement to protect communication networks from cyber events. But the industry was concerned about liability, so in 2006, when we had the Electric Reliability Organization with authority to protect cyber, they went another 9 years without requiring protection, and we have the director of the National Security Agency and other public statements by the federal government indicating we have malware embedded in our grid by Russia and China and in the water and sewer systems. It's hard to get out. So how much progress have we made? Now, we do have from FERC a notice of proposed rulemaking, and they may, in fact, be planning to close this major loophole. There's going to be a technical conference next January, but so that's where we are on cyber. For solar storms, we didn't have much understanding of the frequency of solar storms when the EMP Commission reported in 2008. They mainly focused on EMP. Well, you've heard earlier that in the last several years, we have a consensus of scientists that a severe solar storm of the magnitude of a Carrington event or New York Railroad storm of 1921 is about 12% in 10 years. So it's not a low frequency event. And so how can we get from the hope that we have a, quote, incredibly resilient grid to the reality of an incredibly resilient grid? And I suggest, partly by using the benchmark of where we were in April 2008 with the EMP Commission report and where we are now by just objective standards, We need the whole of community. If we don't have work at the state and local levels, we're not going to make much more progress than we made the last 7 years and 8 months. So what are some of the opportunities? The first is the Energy Policy Act of 2005 has a savings clause to protect the rights of states to set their own reliability standards. The states have the right to protect the transmission and distribution of electricity in their states for safety, adequacy, and reliability. Now, there's also a protection for the bulk power system. It says that the states cannot engage in some regulatory process that makes reliability worse in other states. But the studies that you've seen this year and before show you can protect a high voltage transformer without spreading much trouble, the GIC currents extensively. If you protect the key gateways, just 20%, you reduce the DC current in your transmission system, so even transformers that aren't protected can survive at a higher level of solar storm hazard. So it could be shown scientifically that you can meet the standard to allow the state to have higher reliability, and you're not going to hurt other states. So a lot can be done at the state level through your Public Service Commission or Public Utility Commission, and better yet, at the state level through legislation, which Andrea was successful in doing. So let me just say a little more about Maine, what I think Maine did, even though it has not implemented requirements by the Maine Public Utilities Commission. First, in the process of getting the 2013 legislation, Central Maine Power was asked for the historic data from Chester, Maine. Chester, Maine is the only site in the country. It has a static VAR compensator. So it produces reactive power to cope with voltage collapse in northern Maine. And they have data going back to at least 1990. And they're the only place in the nation which has data going back that far. The Sunburst system from EPRI had data, but apparently it didn't have a computer backup. It lost about a decade's worth of data, as best we know. And they never released the more recent data, the last 15 years of data. So we really don't get much for public researchers out of the EPRI system. But we did from Chester, Maine, and we did because when Andrea was in the Maine legislature, Central Maine Power committed to provide that information publicly. That allowed an expert in Minnesota, John Kappeman and others, to model different storms and compare the levels of geomagnetic current, impacts on transformers, etc. So Maine has helped the rest of the country by improving modeling, just there. And more recently, our foundation had a failure, but sometimes we win through failure. So we petitioned the Maine Public Utility Commission to use an existing statute that said that if a public utility did not adequately protect against weather, that the Public Utility Commission had the right to reduce their rate of return. And we said that space weather is weather. And the statute already exists. We don't need to pass a new one. And we wanted them to open a hearing to determine whether they should reduce the rate of return for Central Maine Power from 11.7%, way over the market rates for bonds and similar financial instruments. And they told us that that wasn't the purpose of the statute. And we didn't go to court over it, but we copied every executive of Central Maine Power, Emera USA, Emera, which is headquartered in Canada, and the holding company, Iberdrola USA, which is ultimately held by a company in Madrid. So all their executives knew that there were people who wanted to dock them financially for failing to address this issue. So we lost, but lo and behold, when we next showed up with Andrea this past September, Central Maine Power was already planning to put in 2 new series capacitors, which save money and protect long transmission lines, the high voltage DC line from New Brunswick, Canada, but they also protect against the solar storm GIC. and they were prepared to put in a reactive power device that cost 4 or 5 times what it would have cost to put neutral ground blockers in the Maine state high voltage transformer system. But that served other purposes, but it also provides reactive power. The irony is, if they had put in neutral ground blocking devices for 16 transformers, that would have taken out even more reactive power, probably. So we don't fully know why they don't want neutral ground blockers now. One, they may be waiting for a signal from FERC, which may come when they put out a rulemaking on the solar storm standard requirement to assess high voltage transformers. And hopefully that they will signal that one can get cost recovery for doing more than the minimum required. So we don't know yet, but Maine is already making progress just by getting the attention that it doesn't really want at the state level. Central Maine Power is taking initiatives on their own, and they identified some of the switching equipment. They've looked at other low-cost ways to improve the reliability of the grid in a solar storm. When they didn't look at EMP, I would have to admit, it's not entirely their fault. The federal government has much more knowledge, and including significant classified information about how to mitigate EMP. And for whatever reason, the head of the section of FERC was not allowed to go help Maine. So it's not as simple as the utility not wanting to do it. They didn't have the technical knowledge.
Bill?
So I think we're going to get a major breakthrough with this new EMP commission, because they have a mandate to look at EMP and solar storms together. But so I'd like to suggest those in other states that have public utilities commissions that haven't assessed the reliability of their grids. There's a great opportunity to appear before those commissions, and there's an opportunity to ask your state legislatures to use the power they have to improve reliability. New Hampshire, for example, has a statute last August, and it requires all the transmission companies in New Hampshire to assess the reliability of their companies and report to the State Public Utility Commission. Lastly, I'd like to go to the lower level, below the state. I think there are at least 2 local opportunities for whole-of-community initiative. One's the education system. Our children and grandchildren are going to grow up in a society that has so much complexity, so much fragility, so much interdependence. We need to train them to understand that this is a challenge for which they can contribute, and as a result, hopefully some of them will enter careers that will help solve some of these problems, and in a blackout, we hope many of them will join in helping recover rather than help looting. So we have that element. And another element we'll have a panel on following has to do with microgrids. If the federal government played a major role initiating the internet through ARPA, and the federal government has a program done jointly by the Department of Energy and Homeland Security and DOD to develop microgrids on military bases. They started at Hickam Field and Pearl Harbor. There are several of them now. But they're not just designed to help individual homeowners. The whole microgrid is managed together. So in a crisis, they can ask for emergency conservation by the homeowners and maintain base operations for critical mission performance. So they are serving as a demonstration project. And I think as we get microgrids that are developed that are net zero energy or at least low energy, there's an opportunity for microgrids developed in the private sector, in communities, and they can, I believe, provide protection against solar weather because they don't have long line connectivity. And Dr. Baker has told me, because I don't know much myself, that one can protect the inverters for the solar panels, that the cost of protecting inverters has come down and the cost of the panels has come down. So if you buy a standard solar system, it's going to have a vulnerable inverter if there's an EMP attack. But one could design methods to shield that are relatively low cost. George said $100 per inverter. I bet that cost is going to come down. So to sum up, there are I take a different view of the state of progress of our, quote, incredibly resilient grid. I don't think it's that resilient. And I don't think we've made much progress. But the way to get progress is not to just count on the federal government, but to work at the state and local level, in the public sector, and to encourage and facilitate private initiatives for microgrids and other new adopter systems. And last aspect, PJM interconnection. On its own, it's the largest of the regional transmission organizations, 13 states and the District of Columbia. On their own initiative, they decided that with the new technologies, wind and solar, they were coming such a high share potentially of their transmission market that they asked them to work with them developing a standard so that when they connect to the transmission system, they have the capability, if the overall transmission system is under voltage, to come in at higher voltage and help stabilize the voltage at the right level. If they come in, if the system is under frequency or over frequency, they can ask the renewables to come in on the opposite side to balance the system. This is not required by the federal government. This is not required by a state government. This is a nonprofit, private sector organization that has a lot of knowledge about grid reliability that acted on its own to harness the early adopters to make the grid more reliable while incorporating more renewables. So I'm just suggesting, don't just think of the federal government to fix the grid. Thank you.
Tom, a yes or no question, and then we have to switch to the next thing.
It's almost a yes or no question. Bill, can you just, because you talked about Maine and Andrea talked about Maine, under the current NERC standard for GMD protection, how many transformers in Maine would need to be protected?
The sad number is 0. But basically, and the sad thing is they were planning to do better before the federal proposed standard came in. And the same with American Transmission in Wisconsin. They had 1 neutral ground blocker. They were planning to do 5. So sometimes this is where we have a dispute with Commissioner LaFleur, who's going to write the order for FERC. She hopes that the floor of her order will not be close to the ceiling. We fear that the floor, we've seen the floor being proposed by FERC, and private initiatives to protect more transformers shriveled up and disappeared. So it's what it is. That's another reason the states could require, at least for their transmission systems, they could require protection too.
Could I just add just one piece to that, and I'm sorry to take any more time, Jeff, but if you know something, if you see something in your state, a piece of legislation or an effort going on, if you'd be willing to call who's ever running it, if you know something that you can contribute, it would be great at a meeting, at a hearing, for you to show up. And even if you don't know much, if you can show up and say you care, you're interested, or you can push state and federal legislators to address this issue, it would be great. I think I'm going to get a rubber stamp that I can just put on when I send my bill payment back, and I still send it in the mail. Something to the effect of protect the grid from EMP and GMD, and just sort of push the fact to the utilities that you know there's a problem and you want it fixed. That would be just great. Thank you.